Thank you all so much for coming to talk about shift left here. So the title of this talk, just to make sure you're in the right place, is Fixing Accessibility After the Fact is Already Too Late. My name is Aaron Gustafson, and I'm joined by a really amazing panel here, and I'll have them introduce themselves in a minute. But being that I'm kind of cheeky, we're going to go around and introduce ourselves using name, role, and value. So I'll take moderator privilege. My name is Aaron Gustafson. I am a principal TPM on the Accessibility Innovation team here at Microsoft. And one of my values is our differences. I think we all have unique perspectives and experiences. And when we feel safe to bring our whole selves to work and to our social interactions, we really create better products and a better culture. And I'm going to pass it over to Yumeng to introduce herself.
Yeah, hi, my name is Yumeng. I'm a computer science PhD student at the University of Washington. And my research is on human-computer interaction, but my interest lies in the intersection of AI and accessibility. And a lot of my current work actually looks at how AI generates code and whether that code is even accessible to begin with. Something I value is making impact on people's lives. For example, when people say AI is helping with accessibility, what drives my motivation and curiosity is really understanding how it's helping and what ways we can improve it.
Thank you. Dylan.
Yeah, hi, my name is Dylan Barrell. My role is cat herder at DQ Systems. I have been focusing on making accessibility sustainable. I think that's the important thing. And in doing that, one thing that I value is how to use technology to do that. So very excited to talk today about how we can use AI in particular and what the pitfalls and the advantages of that are, and how we can do that in a practical way. Because in order for accessibility to be sustainable, it also needs to be practical. So,
awesome. Naveen.
So my name is Naveen Thadani. My role is the co-founder and CEO at Evinced. We're a digital accessibility technology company. And my value, I like to think it's a lot, but my team doesn't let me commit code anymore. So I don't know.
All right, Ed.
I have the same problem. My name is Ed Summers. I'm head of accessibility at GitHub. And the thing that I value most is this lovely accessibility community that we have. I mean, it's great to be in person with you all here. And we need just more IRL community. I love it.
Awesome. All right, so to kick us off, AI didn't just change how we build software, it changed how defects are born and how quickly they propagate. So we're shipping code faster than ever, which is super risky. And numerous studies have shown that code generation models are not that great when it comes to generating accessible code from the jump. So on top of that, the latest WebAIM Million survey shows an uptick in accessibility violations on top homepages across the web. So I'm going to direct our first question to the folks on the panel who are working to address accessibility issues at scale. What are you seeing out there? Is the uptick in the WebAIM Million an early indicator of the tsunami of accessibility issues that AI will be generating? Ed, why don't you kick us off on that?
OK, let's go. I don't want to be an AI apologist or anything, but I think that the WebAIM, this year's WebAIM data, the increase from 51 error barriers found per page on average to 56. That's kind of what we've been referring to here. I don't think that is an indicator of a tsunami. I think that a couple things. The AI models, the foundational models, are trained on years and years and years of human output. So they mirror back what we do as humans. So the AI bias is human bias. And not that none of that's right, and we need to work diligently to remove that bias. But for the purposes of this discussion, can we expect a tsunami of accessibility errors due to the increased use of AI? I don't think so. I think it's a multiply by one in the sense that we're just going to get more of what we've been getting in the past as we use AI more and more. And I think if you look at the trend of the WebAIM data, for example, for the last 8 years, those numbers of barriers per page, they've been between the range of 60 and 50. And 56 this year, 51 last year. The year before that, it was 56. So I think there's just some noise in that data, and it's kind of roughly in line. I think what's exciting to me is the opportunity that we have, the lever that we have with AI in order to remove bias at scale, which is obviously what we're here to talk about.
Great. Dylan, you had some thoughts you wanted to add on this one.
Yeah, I think there's been some studies that have been put out. The problem with any study about AI is that AI moves so fast that by the time the study comes out, it's sort of obsolete. It's kind of one of the things that's going on. So with that being said, one of the studies that has come out recently from CodeRabbit, for example, who are slightly biased, of course, I understand that, but is that just defects in general are going up as we ship more code. And I think this is one of the big problems that organizations are facing today is we can generate code. So the constraint that we used to have in our organization was often not how quickly we could, was how quickly we could create the code. And we've shifted that constraint from how quickly we can create code to how quickly we can determine whether the code that we've created is the right quality in all the different ways in order to be able to ship it. And so quality as a whole, as a problem, has become the sort of bottleneck. People who do, doing code reviews, for example, are now, the bottleneck that we have to deal with. And so organizations are straining, and a lot of them are putting out code, and whether the bugs that they have are accessibility related or whether they're just quality related, dealing with that problem of that new constraint is one of the biggest things that organizations have to deal with. And accessibility is a big part of that as well. It's just one aspect of that.
Yumeng, what Dylan was talking about in terms of the speed at which models are changing, I wonder if you could kind of talk about your research and how trying to figure out what models to map your research against was super challenging because of the models constantly changing under you.
Yeah, I think one thing we struggled the most when coming up with my research study was to select what models to evaluate. And a lot of models, because in research, a lot of what we capture is a snapshot in time, whereas models are constantly changing. Like if, let's say we benchmark some models now, after a few months, new models will come out. And so that's really challenging, right? So one way to combat this is I've designed a testbed called PACE, which stands for Prompt Accessibility Controlled Evaluation. And essentially, it's like a playground where users have the freedom to configure the model they select and how many models they select, what models they select, and alongside with what prompt they choose. And so kind of bringing that system or that test bed in, we can reuse that system to evaluate models now and even in the future.
Circling back to the kind of what's going on in the marketplace, Naveen, I'm curious to see what you all are seeing from the events side in terms of the proliferation of bugs and what concerns or not you may have in this area.
Yeah. So before I get to that real quick, though, I did want to point out one thing. We all look at this WebAIM study every year, and we sort of kind of beat ourselves up about it a little bit, and because it doesn't show much progress and all that. And while it's an okay barometer at a macro level, I think that when you start kind of dissecting things aren't as bad as it seems. First of all, I just wanted to point that out. Our view is a lot more optimistic about where things are at because you focus on the Fortune 500 companies, for instance, as opposed to a small online retailer in Kuwait, which is part of the WebAIM study. I'm not saying that's not important, but when you think of it as frequency weighting, what people actually use, we find that the number of defects on a per page level are much lower. And it's actually a good thing. And when you look at critical defects, it's even lower than that. When you look at web applications as opposed to websites, people are doing a good job. They're trying. I mean, it's far from perfect, but it's nowhere near the doom and gloom that we all kind of think of when we look at the WebAIM study. So that's the first point. Second point is, I'm with Ed on this. The models so far, at least, are trained on the code that humans have written, and it's mostly open source code that they're trained on, which we all know open source is great and known for a lot of things. Accessibility, unfortunately, is not one of them. So they do produce a lot of issues for the most part. But on a unit basis, we can expect AI to generate the same thing. The problem is that there's more code being written because it's easy to write code now. So the total number of defects that you're going to find could actually increase, but on a unit level, it's probably going to be around the same. But from a, again, total perspective, it's going to increase. So that's one inflection point that if we don't do anything, that's the risk. But on the other hand, quite frankly, I think it's easier to harness AI to actually generate accessible code, much more than it is to train a developer. You know, you look at what we've been doing as an industry for a long time. We're training 100 developers. Tomorrow, 33 of them are gone. I mean, literally, people change their job once every 3 years on average. And forget about the fact that it's hard to remember what you studied. I don't remember anything of what I studied in undergrad, let me tell you that, for instance. Right? So it's very difficult to remember what you studied. And on top of that, you're losing 33% of your employees every year. So that way, when you look at it, you know, from an opportunity perspective, I believe we have the right opportunity and the right tools and the right motivation right now to actually reverse that trend and drive it down as close to zero as possible. So I'm very optimistic about what we can do with AI.
Yeah. Hey, can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Yeah. Those are great points, and I think that the turnover is such a great point. And the challenge for us, we talk about AI in isolation, as you know, because it's the latest tool. I think, you know, we can't lose sight of the fact that the developer culture, you know, the culture of the relatively small number of people that build the things that the digital things that the rest of humanity uses, is so incredibly important. And last year, GitHub took a challenge. We took a pledge to help improve the accessibility of open source, due in part to what you had just said about the training. And most people don't know this, but 70 to 90% of the source code in your typical website or your typical application is open source code. If you take all the source code and, you know, put it in one big file, right? 70 to 90% of that source code comes from open source. So we have a lot of work to do there. And in improving the accessibility of open source, I think building a culture of accessibility across the global developer community can put us in a position where accessibility becomes a portable skill that you take from one job with you to the next, as opposed to showing up at a job and like, oh, they want us to do accessibility. Okay, I'll do it here, but I won't do it after that. You know, so I think that's one of our challenges here.
Yeah, and you know, you can always have at this point using technology like MCP and all that to start going out and automatically remediating some of these repos that are out there that are common and what people use. It's another great opportunity and definitely something that should be done. But you know, I was reading the other day how in the Linux kernel now, there's so many automated patches that are coming in that they just can't keep up with that anymore. So we don't want that same problem when we're trying to remediate some of the open source code. Right. But I do think if it's done right, that is the one way to do it, and we should do it.
Okay, one more thing. Open source developers are amazing, and this is in no way, shape, or form dinging open source developers.
Absolutely.
Yeah, most of it's nights and weekends, after hours. Some get paid, not that many. So let's not criticize. I mean, I don't want to criticize them. We want to build them up and support them.
Yeah.
But also to Naveen's point, like don't overwhelm them with giant commits, like 10,000 file changes and stuff like that. Yeah. Like those teams cannot parse that, right? Like it's just not possible to go through that. So if you want to commit to open source, which I highly recommend, make sure that your commits are discrete and fixing a very specific thing, and you don't just like dump a bunch of work in their lap, because that's going to be totally overwhelming for them. One more thing I want to pick up on going back to the WebAIM survey, and I think that Ed and Naveen, you both make really good points about this. We don't talk an awful lot, or at least we don't index really heavily on the fact that it's homepages. And homepages, if anybody who's ever worked on a homepage, like they are very political. They are very marketing driven. They are not necessarily where like the best choices are made. Just gonna throw that out there. And they're they're not where people go to do tasks, right? And so they're not the key things that people are going to interact with your website. They are a front door, and yes, we want that front door to be accessible, but at the same time, to your points, they're not representative necessarily of the quality of the code that's in the rest of the site. So. All right, I want to shift us into our next bit. So as everyone up here is focused on shifting left, I want to shift as far left as we can go when it comes to AI models and talk about the work we need to do in that space to improve the quality of the code that's recommended to us. There's been a little bit of touching on that. I think the point about this was trained on code that we all collectively wrote, which was not always code that we are proud of. I think that's really important. I think also the fact that I have a friend that coined the term the full stack overflow developer, and I think of AI as the full stack overflow developer at scale, because there's lots of stuff out there on Stack Overflow that is not the best advice. And there is a real risk, to Naveen's point, of as there is more AI-generated code out there, that then gets fed into the models, just like when we talk about slop content. We have slop code out there, and it becomes like the snake eating its own tail, the Ouroboros, right? So I think this is something that we need to be thinking about a bunch about. So for years, we've been working to improve the tools and procedures that we have when it comes to identifying and remediating accessibility bugs, but that work often comes late in the software development lifecycle. When it was humans designing the UI and authoring the code, we talked about the importance of education when it comes to accessibility. And now we're in an era where these models have nearly immediate access to far more information than humans can retain. And yet it seems that we're struggling to get them to properly index on the right things when it comes to accessibility. So my question is, are the issues that we're facing in terms of code quality fundamentally about a lack of proper training data, or is it more a question of how we direct code gen models to access the data they already have? Yumeng, why don't you kick us off on this topic? What have you seen in your research?
Yeah, I think one thing that I've seen in my research is that code quality isn't just attributed to the training data and not just a prompting problem either. For example, like if we even have like this ideal training data that we give to the model itself is still essentially a black box. Like how the model, like the way it interprets or thinks about the training data is also a problem. And in my research, we also looked at AI, like generating AI code with different models and with different prompting conditions. But the prompting, like there wasn't a universal prompt that made all the models reliably more accessible, or a way, or like it wasn't a path where the models would output accessible code. And so it may even come down to maybe thinking of ways to even guide the AI models on how to, in a way that it's like, provides guidance that is interpretable for machines to learn. And another thing that we've seen is that it might also be a measurement problem, because a lot of the automated tools that we're seeing actually like is doing like some of the code that is generated by AI actually passes the automated tools, but if you look at the semantic structure, because like in my research I'm focusing on a lot of HTML code, the semantic structure is not exactly accessible to people with disabilities.
It may be technically valid, but not actually usable.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Usable, yeah.
Yeah. Dylan, did you have something you want to add on this one?
Well, yeah, I think people often talk about trust. Can we trust what the models are outputting? And I don't think that's even a relevant question, because we don't trust the code that our human collaborators create either. So for me, it's not about trust at all. It's about how do we take the output that's being generated and how do we test it to make sure that it is, in fact, has the qualities that we want, of which one of them is accessibility, right? This comes back to the question I talked about with scaling this, because this becomes a scaling problem. But aside from the scaling problem, there are certain approaches that we can take. And some approaches are better than others. If we, for example, take agents and we use them to test the output of other agents and we give them very specific prompts on what to do, they can do a decent job of improving the quality of that code overall. But one of the things that we found, and I think this is interesting because I think Ed's going to probably talk about this earlier, but a study that Eric Bailey did surfaced this as well. There's a couple of problems that you have with that. First of all, models in and of themselves have been trained to want to output something, right? And in fact, the head of Anthropic product development said this, that they've explicitly trained Claude to be a willing partner that's can-do and that's action-oriented, right? And so everything they've put into the way that they've created system prompts and the way that they've trained it makes it a great tool for us interacting with it when we're coding. But that same attribute also makes it really bad at doing a comprehensive job of auditing anything, actually. And you see this explicitly in code reviews. If you ask Copilot to do a code review for you, and then you ask it to do a code review again, on the same code without having changed anything in between, you're going to get two different, perhaps overlapping sets of results back. So what you need to understand is the strengths and the weaknesses of the models, what they're good at and what they're not good at, right? And so one of the things that if you try to use the agents to just audit each other, you find is token costs start skyrocketing. And token cost is going to become more and more of a problem. Early on, Anthropic and the other companies, they've been subsidizing the token costs a lot, and we've been using them a lot. But now you start to see the pricing models change. So token cost becomes a big thing, and I think in Eric's study that he did, that was one of the first things they ran into. So I think what you got to do is you got to take this a combination of sort of more deterministic things that don't eat up your token costs, and you got to combine those with the strengths of the models to really get to where you need to get to. So I think looking at the speed is another thing. The AI agents take a long time. So speed, token cost, and determinism are sort of important attributes, and that's I think where some of the approaches that we're taking at DQ can really tie together with this, where we enhance the agents in a deterministic way with things that do comprehensive audits that bring the same results back over and over and over again, and you tie those together with the capabilities of the model is where you achieve the best results. And I think that's sort of the approach that you have to take towards AI, so accessibility enabling these AI workflows. Because for me, as Naveen pointed out, that is the opportunity here. The opportunity is to teach your agentic workflows how to do accessibility. And if you can do that and do a good job of that, then we can really leverage the power of AI to not only move us forward in sort of fast in all the innovative areas, but to do that in a way that it's also accessible at the same time. So that for me is the way we should be thinking about this, and using the AI where the AI is powerful, and using other approaches where that's more appropriate.
I'm going to skip over Naveen real quick and go to Ed, since Eric's piece was mentioned a couple times. I don't know, Ed, do you want to talk to Eric's piece that just came out and sort of what some of his findings were?
Yeah, I'll give you the TLDR. So Eric Bailey is a designer at GitHub on our accessibility team, our accessibility design team. And just simply an amazing accessibility professional. He's worked for the last few months, 2 or 3 months, on building our internal accessibility agent inside of GitHub. He just published a blog post Thursday, this past Thursday, or maybe it was Friday, on github.com/blog. If you look for, just look for the accessibility tag. If
it's in the resources as well on the panel.
Okay, great. And it's a treasure. I reread it again this morning, and I was like, oh yeah, there's so many things that we can learn that he was able to pack into, I don't know, like 1,000 words. I wanted to highlight a couple of those. Well, one thing is the work that Eric did building our agent leveraged years of meticulous human effort, manually testing, manually auditing, and tracking and curating our kind of data set on our accessibility violations that we found within the company. I mean, literally thousands of them. Most of them have been fixed. but they're all cataloged and tagged with WCAG criteria and steps to reproduce. Just really well curated data. Much of that is, by the way, thanks to Dennis Limbury, who runs our governance program. And from this knowledge, this corpus of data. Oh, by the way, important thing. In addition to excellent issue descriptions, there's a link to the PR that resolved those issues. Okay, so we have the diff. And it's not just random diff, it's our tools, our design system, the way that we work at GitHub, which is critically important to get that context, I think. And from this corpus of knowledge of data, Eric built this agent, and it's starting to deliver really nice results. We've got it kind of pinned down on a lab bench, and he's, we're running a pilot study right now internally. And one of the ways we're using it is on reviews of pull requests that come into pull requests for GitHub.com. And we're getting really great results from that. And part of the reason that we're getting great results, I think we have about a 68% resolution rate of those pull requests. There was one more point I wanted to make about that was, oh yes, the bias towards action that Dylan mentioned. AI models, they're going to go try to do something for you, regardless of what you tell them to do. They're going to do something. It may be what you want. It may be what you don't want. But what Eric has been able to do is he did a lot put in a lot of limiting factors on this agent. So to kind of put it in a box and tell it, okay, these are the things you're good at. Don't try anything outside of that box, and just don't generate noise. And some of the things that are outside of that box are really complex interactions. Like, for example, drag and drop, or data grids or tree grids. These are the things that are really hard to get right. And we just walled off the agent and said, no, the humans are going to take care of that for now. So, and that allows us to build confidence and trust in the PRs, the feedback that the agent's given on PRs. So I encourage you to check out that blog post when you get a chance.
Yeah, I love the idea of feeding our own bug data. I think that's such an unused treasure trove of information. And similar to the GitHub team's experience in my own tests, taking and remediating bad code coming from AI coding agents, remediating that manually, and then feeding those diffs back to the agents resolved the issues 100% of the time going forward. So having that as part of the training corpus was really improved things immensely. Naveen, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I'm going to echo a little bit of what Dylan said as well, because I think, and I'll add a couple of points to that. At the end of the day, the problem is quite straightforward. AI models are non-deterministic. They're going to generate code, different kinds of code every time you ask them. The only way to actually make it useful and ensure that things like accessibility are done is via deterministic testing. That is it. And right now, of course, it's evident to see that if you ask AI to generate a web page, we found so many times, there's so many studies out there, 47 errors, and even if you prompt it, then it becomes 46 errors, whatever. But let's say we're optimistic and eventually, we'll get there. How long it takes, who knows? But even if AI is generating accessible code for the most part, you always want to validate it. You have to. So now the question is, what kind of deterministic testing do you have? How much are you covering? How accurate is it? And the kind of things that you were talking about earlier in terms of semantic structure and all not being tested by current tools, well, I can tell you that those kinds of things are possible, and we're doing those today. So the more you cover, the more you can fix automatically and ensure that what comes out is an even higher level of accessibility. So this stuff really matters.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so couple folks have mentioned the pull request, the humble pull request. And it's often the last line of defense when it comes to preventing accessibility bugs from reaching customers. Catching and directly remediating bugs, or at least proposing remediations with more of a human-in-the-loop scenario, is something that AI agents have proven to be really good at. How should we be thinking about these automated systems as part of the software development lifecycle loop? And is the PR the right place for these gates and checks to live? Dylan, do you want to kick us off on this one?
Well, I think the PR is too late, right? As I've always said is we need to shift it as far left as possible, and we need to shift it all the way into design. And then, during code generation, we need to be testing the code as we're generating it before we even submit the pull request. So I think at every step along the way, you have to inject tests into that. So for me, it's the pull request is a necessary thing. We have to have the tests in the pull request because they catch things that slip through in our process, things that slip through in our technology and our approach and in our testing, right? So we need it, but it's not enough. So for me, it's about what are those tight loops? Everybody talks about agentic development. What most people are doing today is they're sitting in front of Claude and they're asking it to do stuff and then they're testing that, right? But where it's moving towards is sort of fully agentic development where you have humans at particular points. In fact, that's the only way we're really going to scale is by elevating humans to the points where they can make the really high quality decisions and let the coding agents do the rest. So for me, as we see this evolution from where we are to where we're moving towards, the question becomes, how do you test at every stage in the loops where, as Mac Pocock likes to call it, the AFK loop, right? Where the human is away from keyboard and the agents are working. So for me, it's about how do we insert accessibility thinking, accessibility coding, and accessibility testing at every stage along the way, including where the human is away from the keyboard, as well as presenting that information to the human so that they can make a determination. Has this agent's coding loop, have they done the accessibility testing in the way that they should have done that, and be looking at the results? So for me, that's kind of where things are moving to and the sort of approach that we should be thinking about.
Yeah, I love that. I'm curious, just kind of for the audience, from y'all's perspective, there's so many tools that we have now for when we're working with agents in the coding context. We have instruction files, we have agent files, we have sub-agents, we have orchestrators, we have skills. We have deterministic tools that we can have the agents run, like Xcore or like evinced unit testing, those sorts of things. How should people be thinking about all of these tools and how they work together and how to get the sort of most bang for the buck, I guess? And I didn't even mention MCP, but like all of these different things. Naveen, do you want to kick us off on that one? And then
Yeah, I can describe what we see as a basic scenario, and then I'll talk about a little bit more advanced one. But at the basic level, you imagine you're a developer sitting in front of Cursor or Claude Code or whatever, and you just built your feature. I don't know, some form on some page, okay? A couple of drop-downs, a button, whatever the case may be. We have systems today where you can just go in and say, all right, well, remediate that or fix that or whatever. And it'll basically run a deterministic test. It'll then come back with a set of issues, and then you can give the machine, the agent in this case, agent-specific fix instructions. You manage the context in a certain way, and all of that can now be fixed automatically. So as Dylan was saying, you have when you do your pull request, it's already clean, at least for the most part, right? That's one way to do it. But there is a problem in that the developer still has to do something. They have to go out and actively say, I want to fix any accessibility issues in this piece of code that I just developed before I push it further down the line. Sometimes it's hard to do even that, okay, to be honest. That's just where we are. So there are many ways that you can get around that and have this sort of deterministic testing, these guardrails, or the new word these days is harness engineered, so whatever. But you can, in many ways, there's the skill files you mentioned, there's configurations at the repo level, there's all kinds of things you can do. You can integrate it into automated tests that happen as well. So you write an automated test, or the agent writes an automated test, inserts accessibility in there. If there's an issue, GitHub action gets triggered, code gets fixed, and there you go. It can happen fully automatically as well. So I think it really depends on your development model. It depends on the architecture that you have internally. But all the necessary ingredients are there already to be able to significantly improve the quality of code from an accessibility perspective, just out of the box right now.
Yeah, I think Naveen said something, 2 words that triggered me because I think about these a lot. And these are things that I think everybody who's in the accessibility industry should be paying attention to. There's 2 words, harness engineering and context engineering, right? And if you hear these words inside your organization, this is your opportunity, because I think Naveen hinted at it if he didn't say it, but one of the things that's a huge opportunity from an AI coding perspective, from an accessibility perspective, is AI agents do what you tell them to do. They don't complain about it. They don't say, no, that's too much work, or I don't know how to do that, or whatever. They do it. And the better the context you give them, and the better the tools that you give them, in order to be able to do that, the better the job that they're going to do. So what harness and context engineering is about how we engineer these loops that are becoming more and more automated, what sort of process we build, where the human gets pulled into it, and when they don't, what gets created as the artifact that comes out of that then has to be reviewed. And the context is important, because context is at least 3 things. It's the context of the repo that you're working on. What are the rules of that repo? What sort of tools are available in that repo? How do you do testing in that repo, etc. And then there's the context, more generically about how do we do accessibility testing in this company? That's sort of repo agnostic. And you have to tie these things together in order to achieve the outcome. So harness engineering is not only about creating that, but it's also about looking at the data as stuff is moving through that and analyzing what is working well. And so, I mean, this is a much bigger topic than just accessibility, but accessibility is one of those things. Mm-hmm. So one of the things you can do if you're setting up your harness correctly is you can create these history files where you can look at the interactions between the different agents and what caused that churn. And churn is bad from a lot of perspectives. It costs money, it costs time. And you can then say, why are they churning? And then you can modify your context and your tools and your harness to eliminate that source of churn, right? So when you hear people talking about this is an opportunity for you as an accessibility professional to say, how do I get involved in those activities within my team or within my organization? So I can accessibility enable those AI processes, because if organizations right now are redesigning the way they do software development, that's a huge opportunity for us to get accessibility baked in. So if you hear those keywords, jump on it and find out how you can get involved in making those harnesses and that context engineering sort of accessibility enabled. That's my sort of big, if there's one takeaway you want from that I'd like you to take away from what I'm saying up here today, it's look for that and do that, because that's the opportunity.
I want to pick up on 2 things that each of you, one thing that each of you touched on. In terms of the reading your model's logs, I think that there's huge value in doing that to look for those bottlenecks, those inefficiencies. With one caveat, that there's been some research that actually the models are lying about their chain of thought in some cases, so take it with a grain of salt. Second thing is, Naveen mentioned having AI help you by writing tests. I think that can be super useful, but at the same time, a lot of these models, they want to please, so they want to create a test that is going to be green. So it would not surprise me, because I've seen it. I see them mock all sorts of different API endpoints. I would not be surprised if one had mocked AXCore to always return green. But I think those are some of the things that we need to also be aware of in terms of how we're working with these models, and just being sort of realistic about what their strengths and weaknesses are. Yimeng, I'm wondering from your research, because you were looking a lot at the ways that we were prompting models, and a lot of that can then feed into the way that we're writing agent files or skills, how we're addressing the model. I'm wondering if you could share some of your insights from your research.
Yeah, so what we looked at is different levels. In my research, we looked at different levels of accessibility guidance. So the lowest guidance would be no guidance. And then the second level would be just saying the word or the keyword accessible into the prompt. And then the third would just be taking some factors from WCAG and entering it into the guidance and seeing how the AI responded. But I think dives deeper than just prompting, because what we found is that there's like not a magical prompt that made code more accessible, like the AI code output more accessible. And I think it's not as simple as just saying like, oh, just tell the AI agent to write accessible code. I think that puts a lot of pressure on the user and a lot of trust on the AI model. And so I think there's a lot of factors beyond just prompting and just guiding the model. So, but again, like it feels like a big black box where we're not certain like what factor is causing what. It could be the evaluation metric, it could be the model itself, it could be the prompting, could be even like prompting can be even configured with this overall system instruction versus the specific request or task you're asking it to do, and even what you're asking it to output. Because what we're seeing because like in my research, we're looking at specifically HTML form components, and what we found is like the easier form components are, like, for example, like a submit button might be just more accessible by default than, like, let's say something more complicated like a toggle switch or something with like validation or helper text, et cetera.
All right, Ed, I wanted to come over to you, and I actually wanted to ask you a little bit to talk about the accessibility scanner and some of the work that you're doing in the PR space. And you made an interesting point as well in kind of our early discussions about this, about the opportunity for just-in-time training for engineers who are reviewing the PRs and stuff. I was wondering if you could talk to those.
Yeah, sure. So recently, in the last few months, 6 months ago, we released our accessibility scanner at GitHub. There's a couple key things about that. One, based on AXT4 for deterministic scanning. And then just recently, we've added a plugins architecture, which is opening up lots of new possibilities for interactive testing. The first built-in plugin that we're shipping that's available to everybody, as opposed to something you can do on your end in your repo, tests for reflow. 1.4.10? I think it's 1.4.10. Yeah, I can't remember the numbers. WCAG 1.4.10 reflow, and so stay tuned for more interesting things coming out there. And also, if you're using the scanner, you can start to build your own custom extensions there. So, by default, the scanner will assign issues that it creates, which are the description. We speak of prompting. Yuman's been working a lot on prompting. The description of the issues that are filed are essentially prompts for GitHub Copilot to create a PR for the fixes. And those prompts, like Yuman is saying, they really do matter. And then the other thing that's really relevant here and that everybody can do, this is almost a freebie, I mean, there are certain things we can do that are almost, they're really easy to do, and they're going to have a pretty large positive impact with relatively few negative impacts. And that is to use custom instructions, which we also might call the system prompts. The place to go look for the latest thinking on custom instructions is Michael Fairchild here at Microsoft. He works in the security division. He's done really great work on evaluating kind of how custom instructions affect outputs with different models. Do you have that in our resource?
Yeah, it's in the resources
okay,
as well. Yeah.
Great. It's called the A11Y LLM eval. And if you combine this kind of automatic assignment of issues to GitHub Copilot with custom instructions in your repo, with good model selection, because we know that model selection matters, you can just really, you can start to eliminate accessibility debt before it gets started, and which is really what we want to do, shifting left.
Yeah, we found the same thing actually. With we have as part of our MCP tool, we have a remediation tool where you pass it the context of the defect, and it uses the DQ University knowledge in the back end to then give you back the exact context you need on how to address that problem. And we found that together with the fact that the agent itself has the context of the source code, allows it to then really translate that very specific guidance on that particular type of issue into a really high quality remediation very, 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 very consistently. So yeah, there's ways you can do that in a sort of a static way, and then there's ways you can do it sort of more dynamically like that as well.
Yeah, there's one point I'd like to make. We're talking about these sorts of things, and in some ways, there's a bigger risk that we haven't addressed yet. We're kind of sitting here, for the most part, all of us care a lot about accessibility. We're all sort of involved with our development teams, and we think about it a lot. But unfortunately, this is a bit of an echo chamber because we're not considering what the rank and file front-end developer has to go through and is thinking about on a day-to-day basis. And it's not very much of accessibility, unfortunately, right? So I can give you an example, and it's best to understand this through an example. I was talking to an engineer, a front-end engineer at a healthcare company. And we kind of challenged her, turn around and say, all right, well, how are you going to solve accessibility? Forget the tooling and all that. Like, what's your basic thought here? So she goes to Claude Code and says, test for accessibility. And it came back with like some certain number of errors. And then she said, okay, go fix these issues. So no validation of whether the issues are correct, not this or that. Go and fix these issues. And it turns out that the 30 issues that Claude tried to fix all at once was just inundated the context entirely. There were no guardrails. There was nothing. And talk about thrashing. This is a token burning factory. Like, this is what's going on. I mean, people think like that. So yeah, we can all sit here and say we got tools and we got harnesses and we can remediate things automatically, this and that. But at the end of the day, front-end architects in these large development teams need to be the ones to actually integrate these sorts of technologies into the fabric, because otherwise it's not going to happen.
Yeah, there needs to be rigor around that process.
Yeah. I mean, not everybody's like Ed, not every company is like Microsoft where you can try to build your own tools and this and that. Certainly you can try, and if you're an average sort of enterprise out there, do you want to be in the business of building accessibility tooling for yourself?
Yeah.
How are you gonna? I just
jump in?
Yeah.
Because I think this comes back to one of your questions you asked earlier that we forgot to mention is the PR, kind of the opportunities around PRs, and including AI and PRs, AI review and PRs, and that is a just-in-time training opportunity for those developers. Because that developer can go off and say, okay, test for accessibility, and then fix all those, and then she's going to create a PR, okay? But if all that's trash, then we can put in places places to catch that slop at PR, and in doing so, in order to address the issue comments, or the PR comments that are being raised by a good accessibility agent. That requires a human developer to read those, accept or reject. And in reading those, because I see this all the time in the work that we do at GitHub, the explanations of why the diff is being suggested in the PR are really good. And one of our discussions as we were preparing for this panel was taking the outputs and pulling it back around. All right, well, if we can go back to the humans, and train them along the way, especially at scale. Because if every code change that you ship in your organization has to go through a PR process, and you're getting feedback to your developers and just-in-time training, literally hundreds or thousands of those a day, right? That's going to make a difference.
Yeah, actually, your organization put out together with the Pragmatic Programmer, put out a study. I think I read it yesterday. So interesting thing when you mentioned that developers reading pull request comments. I don't think they read them anymore. And I think one of the things that came out of that study was leadership at organizations is pushing more and more for more and more speed, and they don't care about the code quality as much anymore. And so there's a lot of pressure on developers to just sort of say, fix it, like Naveen said, right? Like, that's the response. Oh, you found these things? Okay, fix them. Becomes the challenge. So becomes the standard response. So I think that's sort of a reality that we have to accept, is that we're moving into a situation where developers, they're no longer writing code. They don't write code anymore. Like, nobody writes code anymore. But they're going to stop reading code pretty soon, too. I mean, they're not going to read any lines of code, ever. And so I think it's great to talk about kind of where the past was, but I think what we should be thinking about is where it's moving to, because we need to set ourselves up for that future where developers aren't reading code, developers aren't writing code. And so now what do we need to do?
Yeah, that's where I think it becomes really important that we teach people how to ask the right questions to the model, and ask, oh, why did you approach it this way? Or before they start coding, say, like, develop a plan for me and explain why you need to make all of the changes that you're suggesting and what they're going to fix. Circling back to the like tons of issues that get found by AI, I'd say the same thing goes for accessibility testers. If your accessibility testers aren't particularly knowledgeable, you can end up with a lot of noise in that space as well, where you've got things that people are suggesting fixes that are actually going to make the system less accessible.
Sure.
So problems across the board. So we've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to kind of try and bring us towards the end here. So no single org can solve this alone. The ecosystem has to interoperate, and we have to learn from each other if we're going to crack this nut, which is why I have all of you on stage. So to meet this moment, we need to get all hands on deck. We need to improve the models themselves. We need to consider how we prompt them. We need to consider the tools that we hand them, how they integrate into our current and future processes. We also need to recognize that AI's ability to help us scale up our ability to find and remediate bugs is not the end of the story. It's only the beginning. If anything, it frees us up to shift the focus from simple accessibility bugs that we just can't seem to eradicate to more complex interactions that we need time to ponder and to explore, places that we need to apply our human creativity and our human ingenuity. So as we close out, I'd like to pass the mic around one more time to our panel and ask everyone to please share something that excites you about this moment or something that you would like to encourage our audience to investigate further. Naveen, why don't you kick us off on this?
Yeah, I think there's only one thing, and I'll say it again, it's deterministic testing. That is the most important thing in today's day and age. That's it.
Wow, that was succinct.
It was really...
We got an extra 5 minutes on the panel.
Yeah. So Ed, you can take a while. Why don't you go next?
Yeah, all right, great. All right. Let me, hang on.
You got at least 5 minutes.
Yeah, right. No, I'll make it quick too. Yeah. So I've developed this little metaphor for a strong accessibility leader in today's rapidly changing environment. Because we talked so much about AI, but the people in this whole thing are so important. And the accessibility professionals out there who are dealing with this rapid change that's being forced upon them, and are rapidly adopted, can be overwhelming. Most accessibility programs are one person, and they're overwhelmed. So I think, what does a strong accessibility leader look like today? My metaphor for that is a dumbbell. And on one end of the dumbbell, we have a eagerness, a embracing of this opportunity that we have with AI, knowing that it's changing opportunities, knowing all the uncertainties and how rapidly it's changing. But the only way to deal with that, it's one thing that going blind has taught me, y'all, is that when change comes, you just got to get in there and embrace it. You cannot fight this. So I think leaders need to embrace this change and jump into these discussions with these wonderful panelists here and the others that were mentioned. And then the other end of the dumbbell is a focus on the humans. That's the humans that use our technologies, that need accessibility, with a focus on user research. User testing with our friends from Fable or other organizations like that is absolutely critical. Design, actual thoughtful design. And also a good understanding of the human psychology of the developers, the people that are, and the pressures upon them, both in the open source community and in the private sector. Because the psychology of those developers, those designers, those professionals is a factor that can make or break our success when we're putting together, when we're building accessibility programs. And then the bar between those two ends of the dumbbell is that strong leader that's embracing the human side and the rapidly changing AI side.
Great. Yumeng.
Yeah, what a great metaphor, Ed. I'm going to go against me and say that I would encourage everyone to look at the gap between accessibility checkers or checks and support accessible use. That comes down to evaluation design, since, like for example, because like a lot of AI right now is essentially like all the benchmarks that I've been seeing is always so automated, and a lot of these automated checks might like say something is accessible. For example, alt text is a great way to think about it, where the automated checker might look at alt text and be like, oh, well, yeah, this image has alt text, so it passes automated checker. But if the alt text isn't meaningful, then what's the point of having alt text to begin with? And so, yeah, just seeing like what are we even evaluating, what's missing, what are we really incentivizing AI to look at. And because if our metrics are shallow, then the models that gets trained on might just learn accessibility that's shallow as well.
That's great. All right, Dylan, take us home.
Yeah, I think you probably could guess what I'm going to focus on. Ed said something very important, I think, which we need to take into account when thinking about what to recommend to people. If there's one accessibility person in an organization, what do you do in a world where AI is becoming more and more the way we do things? AI is speeding everything up. It's shifting constraints. We're struggling as organizations on how to deal with those constraints. What can a single person do or a small number of people do? They can find the leverage, the high leverage points, and try to insert themselves there. So when I talked about context engineering, harness engineering, those are the points that they can look to insert themselves in to get the most leverage, right? Don't spend your time evaluating alt text of images. Don't spend your time doing manual audits or whatever. Try to spend your time figuring out how to make that process, that AI-driven process, accessible, so that you can elevate yourself into the position where you can do things that are more valuable. Because the stuff at the end or the beginning in terms of user research is where accessibility experts should be spending their time. But if they're constantly spending their time evaluating alt text and doing accessibility audits manually, then they never get the time to do that. And AI, for me, AI leveraged in the right way is a huge opportunity for them to get out of the job of doing that really grunt work and doing the stuff that really matters. And there's two things that matter. It's the stuff at the front and the back end, the discovery and the user research, and it's making the process produce accessible stuff by default.
Awesome. What a great note to end on. So I just want to thank our panel very much for their insights today, for sharing their time with us. And I want to thank all of you for coming as well. If you don't mind taking a moment and sharing your feedback on this session, we would absolutely appreciate that as well. And feel free to come up and ask us questions afterwards. The title slide of this also has all of our LinkedIns if you want to reach out to us asynchronously from this event as well. Thank you all again. Have a great day.
Cheers.
Scheiße. Scheiße.